the simulation chamber convulsed with manufactured violence. Smoke billowed in crystalline spirals, backlit by emergency strobes that painted the reinforced walls in alternating scarlet and shadow. Through the observation deck's quantum glass viewport, Xerith pressed her elongated fingers against the cool surface, watching impossibly as her carefully constructed nightmare failed to break the human subjects below. The blast had been calculated with mathematical precision. Her neural mapping arrays hummed with collected data, electromagnetic tendrils, sampling the psychological stress radiating from each test subject like invisible fire. The explosive scenario should have triggered immediate mental collapse, synaptic overload cascading through their primitive mammalian neural networks, until conscious thought fragmented into protective catatonia. Instead, the humans moved forward. Beryl emerged from the smoke like some ancient war deity stepping through the veil between worlds, his movements fluid despite the chaos surrounding him. Sweat gleamed on his forehead, catching the strobing light in ways that made Xerith's secondary respiratory chambers flutter involuntarily. His voice cut through the simulated pandemonium with commanding clarity, directing his trainees deeper into the psychological maelstrom rather than away from it. Every sensor reading defied 3 decades of her research. The Warburg Academy had been her sanctuary, her temple of understanding, where she had mapped the precise psychological territories of 47 different sentient species. Within these walls of brushed metal and crystalline memory cores, she had established the immutable laws governing mental resilience, documented the exact coordinates where rational minds surrendered to trauma and fear. Now this human was rewriting her universe with his mere presence. The simulation's final crescendo erupted around them. Xerith's throat sacs contracted as stress readings spiked beyond what any known species could survive without permanent neurological scarring. Her equipment registered psychological pressure, equivalent to witnessing the extinction of one's homeworld. Trauma so profound it should have required generations of healing to process. The humans finished their exercise with what appeared to be satisfaction. When the chamber's doors cycled open with a pneumatic whisper, Beryl stepped into the observation deck, carrying the scent of ozone and determination. His species' peculiar mixture of vulnerability and strength had always unsettled her. But now something else stirred beneath her professional fascination. The way his dark eyes held hers with unwavering confidence spoke of depths she had never bothered to chart. The readings are impossible. Her translator struggled with concepts that had no equivalent in her native harmonics, producing sounds like distant wind chimes caught in cosmic storms. You exceeded safe psychological exposure parameters by 400%. Beryl's expression shifted, confusion replacing the combat readiness that had defined his features moments before. Safe parameters. She gestured toward the holographic displays materializing around them, complex mathematical models rendered in 3-dimensional light. According to 17 different theoretical frameworks, your subjects should be experiencing cascading neural breakdown, permanent psychological scarring, the kind of mental trauma that destroys civilizations. He studied her data with the same intensity she had observed him applying to the simulation, and something in his gaze made her neural pathways spark with unfamiliar electricity. We call it stress inoculation. You can't prepare for real trauma by avoiding fake trauma. The mind adapts, grows stronger under controlled pressure. Xerith's primary optical sensors dilated until the chamber's ambient lighting seemed harsh and unforgiving. The concept violated every survival instinct her species had evolved across millennia of careful psychological preservation. Her people had perfected the art of avoiding mental stress, constructing elaborate social structures designed to shield developing minds from anything that might cause lasting damage. The idea of deliberately seeking psychological trauma was not just alien to her understanding, it was madness. Your medical evaluations show no evidence of deterioration despite repeated exposure to lethal stress levels. She accessed her portable analysis unit, its quantum processors humming as they reviewed terabytes of impossible data. This contradicts fundamental principles of neural architecture. Beryl moved closer, close enough that she could detect the subtle chemical signatures of his exertion. The way his body processed stress hormones that would have poisoned most other species. Maybe your principles don't account for how evolution actually works. Humans don't run from challenges, we learn from them. The corridor beyond her laboratory stretched in both directions, filled with cadets from dozens of species, learning conventional psychological warfare resistance techniques, meditation exercises, mental shielding protocols, rapid trauma recovery methods, all the traditional approaches that had served galactic civilization for centuries. None of them were being systematically traumatized as preparation for worse trauma. Her research facility occupied an entire wing of the academy, its walls lined with neural mapping displays that pulsed with the rhythm of collected thoughts, psychological analysis equipment humming with the accumulated wisdom of her life's work. Everything she had built, every theory she had proven, every boundary she had mapped with painstaking precision. All of it challenged by one impossible human and his impossible methods. Beryl examined her equipment with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of precision, his fingers hovering above interfaces that could sample thoughts themselves. Impressive work. What kind of psychological preparation do you recommend for species like mine? The question struck her like a physical blow. Standard protocols emphasize avoidance and recovery, teaching subjects to recognize psychological triggers before they cause damage. Mental compartmentalization techniques to isolate trauma from operational thinking. Recovery meditation to repair neural pathways after stress exposure. His laugh was not mocking, but it carried undertones that made her manipulator appendages tremble. You're describing how to survive psychological warfare, not how to win it. The distinction had never occurred to her. In all her years of research, she had focused on mapping the boundaries of mental resilience rather than questioning whether those boundaries were immutable. Her work had been about preservation, not transformation. Want to see the difference? Beryl gestured toward the advanced simulation suites, chambers designed for psychological research, so extreme she had never dared use them personally. I can show you our actual training progression. Fair warning, though, it might challenge some assumptions about mental limitations. The prospect of understanding this impossible phenomenon outweighed 3 decades of careful caution. Xerith authorized access to the restricted chambers, spaces filled with technology capable of inducing psychological states that bordered on the metaphysical. She had always considered them too dangerous for any rational being to experience. Beryl activated a sequence labeled Intermediate Stress Conditioning Protocol 7. The chamber transformed around them with seamless technological precision, reality reshaping itself into a battlefield that assaulted every sense simultaneously. Visual chaos erupted in perfect synchronization with auditory overload, while olfactory processors released scents of destruction and desperation. The psychological pressure was immediate and overwhelming, stress levels spiking to what Xerith's instruments registered as immediately lethal to mental health. The humans stepped into the nightmare without hesitation. For 37 minutes, she watched in fascination that bordered on religious awakening as Beryl navigated progressively deteriorating scenarios. Each time the psychological pressure approached what should have been his absolute breaking point, he adapted, found new reserves of mental strength, developed real-time coping mechanisms that her theories insisted were impossible. His neural patterns showed strain but never collapse. Growth, not degradation. Evolution, not destruction. When the simulation finally ended, he emerged with the controlled exhaustion of someone who had pushed themselves to beneficial limits rather than destructive ones. That was moderate training intensity. Advanced protocols involve extended exposure to combat stress, ethical paradoxes with no resolution, and scenarios designed to challenge every assumption about survival and moral responsibility. Xerith felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of existence itself. You deliberately expose yourselves to the most psychologically destructive experiences available, repeatedly, as preparation for experiences that are objectively worse. That's the basic concept. We've discovered that beings who train this way don't just survive real trauma, they excel when facing it. They're mentally prepared for chaos instead of being overwhelmed by chaos. Her research database contained extensive studies on post-traumatic recovery protocols, psychological resilience factors across multiple species, comprehensive analyses of mental breakdown patterns under various stress conditions. Every model predicted that Barrel's methods should produce endemic psychological pathology among human populations. Instead, the data showed enhanced mental resilience that bordered on the supernatural. This transforms everything we understand about psychological warfare doctrine. She began accessing strategic analyses, combat effectiveness studies, historical military outcomes across dozens of different conflicts. If humans can be conditioned to thrive under psychological pressure that incapacitates other species, you possess a tactical advantage that approaches the decisive. The implications cascaded through her consciousness like stellar collapse, each realization more staggering than the last. Human military formations would be functionally immune to standard psychological warfare techniques. Traditional tactics designed to break enemy morale through terror and stress would not merely fail against humans, they might actually enhance human combat effectiveness. Beryl settled into one of her research chairs, and the way he moved spoke of someone comfortable with both physical and mental challenges. His expression grew more serious, revealing depths of intelligence she was only beginning to appreciate. That's why Command sent me here. They need to understand whether other species can learn our stress conditioning techniques, or if this is something uniquely human. The question represented the culmination of everything she had dedicated her existence to understanding. If human psychological resilience could be taught to other species, it would revolutionize military preparation throughout the galaxy. If it could not, humans would possess an insurmountable strategic advantage in any conflict involving psychological endurance. Your neural architecture allows for adaptation under extreme stress rather than breakdown under moderate stress. She reviewed comparative brain scans, noting structural differences in human psychological frameworks that should have been inconsequential but were apparently revolutionary. Most species develop permanent neural pathways that reinforce trauma responses as protective mechanisms. Humans appear to develop pathways that minimize trauma impact through systematic exposure. Beryl leaned forward with sudden intensity, his proximity making her aware of the subtle electromagnetic field that surrounded all carbon-based life forms. So you're saying we don't just resist psychological warfare, we've turned it into an educational tool. The ramifications were staggering beyond her capacity to fully process. Every military doctrine in the galaxy assumed psychological warfare would be equally effective against all sentient species. Command structures were designed around protecting personnel from mental stress. Battle tactics prioritized minimizing psychological trauma to friendly forces while maximizing it among enemies. Humans had evolved beyond those fundamental limitations. But there was something more, something that touched the core of her individual identity rather than merely her professional understanding. Xerith had built her sense of self around being the galaxy's foremost expert in psychological breaking points, mapping the precise coordinates where rational minds surrendered to overwhelming pressure. Now she was forced to confront the possibility that everything she thought she knew about mental resilience was not just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong. I need to understand the progression. Her voice carried harmonics she had never heard from her own vocal cords before, sounds that spoke of fascination rather than mere scientific curiosity. How do you transform subjects from normal psychological baseline to advanced stress resistance without causing the permanent damage that every other species would suffer? Beryl's expression suggested he was evaluating something more complex than her ability to comprehend his answer. The process requires voluntary participation. Subjects have to choose to push beyond their psychological comfort zones repeatedly. Fear, pain, exhaustion, moral ambiguity, all of it becomes training material instead of obstacles to avoid. Voluntary trauma exposure. The concept still felt like contradiction made manifest, opposing everything evolution should have taught intelligent species about survival and mental preservation. Show me. The words escaped before conscious thought could restrain them, carrying implications that sent ripples of anticipation through her nervous system. For the next several hours, Beryl demonstrated progressively advanced human conditioning techniques, while she watched cadets voluntarily enter scenarios that should have shattered their minds, then emerged demonstrably stronger and more capable than before. Each session pushed psychological boundaries further than her species would consider survivable. The humans called it embracing discomfort. By the time the demonstrations concluded, Xerith's worldview had undergone fundamental reconstruction. Her research on psychological breaking points had been accurate for every species, except the one that mattered most. Humans did not just resist psychological warfare. They had transformed it into a form of personal development that enhanced rather than diminished their capabilities. This requires comprehensive revision of galactic military doctrine. Her statement carried the weight of civilizations shifting in their orbits. Standard psychological warfare techniques may actually strengthen human forces rather than weakening them. Beryl nodded with the gravity of someone who understood the cosmic implications of what they had discovered together. Command is concerned about exactly that scenario. If other species cannot adapt human conditioning methods, humans become the dominant military force in the galaxy by default, not through superior technology or greater numbers, but through psychological resilience that borders on the mystical. The strategic ramifications were enormous, but Xerith found herself focused on a more personal question. As a psychological warfare specialist, she had spent her career developing methods to break enemy minds through controlled application of stress and fear. Her entire professional identity revolved around exploiting psychological vulnerabilities. What happened to specialists like her when the enemy was immune to psychological attack? I want to experience it. The words surprised her as much as they appeared to surprise Beryl, carrying conviction that seemed to emerge from depths of her consciousness she had never explored. I want to understand how this process works from the subject's perspective. Beryl studied her with the intensity of someone evaluating both capability and commitment. The conditioning process will be psychologically challenging in ways your species has never encountered. The risk of permanent mental damage is real and significant. But the potential for understanding how human psychological resilience actually functioned was worth any risk she could imagine. Xerith had dedicated her existence to mapping the boundaries of mental strength. Now, she needed to discover whether those boundaries could be transcended rather than merely endured. If you are committed to this path, we begin with carefully controlled exposure to manageable stress levels. constant monitoring, immediate extraction protocols. The moment your psychological indicators suggest damage approaching irreversibility, we terminate the process. She agreed, knowing she was stepping into territory no member of her species had ever explored, let alone survived. For 3 decades, she had studied psychological breaking points from the outside, treating mental resilience as a finite resource to be preserved rather than developed. Now she would discover whether consciousness itself could be trained to grow stronger under pressure rather than weaker. The following morning found her entering her first stress conditioning session. Beryl had designed a scenario specifically calibrated for her species. Psychological pressure carefully measured to challenge her capabilities without exceeding theoretical safe parameters. 5 minutes into the simulation, she understood why humans seemed psychologically invincible. The experience transcended mere survival of stress. It was learning to function within psychological pressure, accepting it as environmental background rather than existential threat. Instead of fighting the mental pressure, the conditioning taught her to work with it, transform it from obstacle into tool. When the session concluded, Xerith felt something unprecedented in her species' recorded history, the desire to attempt the experience again at increased difficulty levels. Over the following weeks, she progressed through increasingly challenging scenarios under Beryl's careful supervision, each session pushing her further beyond what her people considered safe psychological parameters. Each time, instead of experiencing the predicted breakdown, she adapted. Her research notes documented the process with meticulous precision. Neural pathway analysis revealed her brain developing entirely new stress response patterns, creating psychological resilience where none had existed before. The changes were measurable, reproducible, and contrary to every theory about mental health her civilization had developed over millennia. Beryl had been correct. Consciousness could be conditioned like physical muscle, growing stronger under controlled stress rather than weaker. But the implications extended far beyond military applications. If psychological resilience could be developed rather than simply preserved, it fundamentally altered assumptions about mental health, educational philosophy, and species development potential. Her people had spent countless generations protecting themselves from psychological challenges that could have transformed them into something far more capable. The final examination came 6 standard weeks into her conditioning program. Beryl designed a scenario combining multiple stress factors. Psychological pressure, equivalent to what human special forces encountered in their most advanced combat preparation protocols. By her species' medical standards, the experience should have been immediately fatal to mental health. Xerith not only survived the ordeal, she performed effectively throughout its duration. When she emerged from the simulation chamber, Beryl was reviewing her biometric data with obvious satisfaction mixed with something that might have been pride. Congratulations, you just completed conditioning that most of your species would consider theoretically impossible. She felt fundamentally different, transformed by the experience in ways that went beyond mere psychological adaptation. The constant low-level anxiety that had defined her people's approach to mental challenges was gone, replaced by quiet confidence in her ability to handle whatever psychological pressure existence might provide. This knowledge changes everything. Her voice carried new harmonics, sounds that spoke of strength rather than preservation. Not just military doctrine, but our entire approach to psychological development. My people have been limiting themselves for generations, avoiding challenges that could have made us stronger. Beryl moved closer, and she realized that her perception of his proximity had changed as well. Where once his presence had been merely professionally interesting, now it carried undertones of attraction that she recognized, but had never experienced before. That's the real secret of human psychological resilience. We do not avoid discomfort, we learn from it. Every other species in the galaxy has been trying to eliminate psychological stress from their development programs. We deliberately add more. The Academy's alert system, activated with crystalline urgency, emergency signals indicating actual psychological warfare, attack on nearby colonial installations. Real combat scenarios, not simulation. Command requests volunteer specialist teams for counter-psychological warfare operations. The announcement carried the weight of genuine crisis. Extreme psychological stress environment predicted. High casualty probability among standard personnel. Xerith looked at Beryl, understanding something fundamental about human nature that had previously eluded her analytical frameworks. They did not just train for psychological challenges because circumstances required it. They sought such challenges because testing themselves against increasingly difficult obstacles was essential to their species' psychological architecture. I volunteer. The conviction in her voice surprised her with its intensity. Beryl smiled, and she realized she was finally beginning to understand the full complexity of human facial expressions. Welcome to the team. As they prepared for deployment, Xerith realized her career, studying psychological breaking points, had evolved into something entirely unprecedented. Instead of mapping the limits of mental resilience, she was now helping to eliminate such limits entirely. The galaxy's approach to psychological warfare was about to undergo revolutionary transformation. Beginning with two specialists who had learned that the human approach of embracing mental challenges rather than avoiding them could transform any species willing to push beyond their assumed limitations. In the transport vessel heading toward the crisis zone, Xerith reviewed mission parameters that would have terrified her mere weeks earlier. Now, they simply represented the next level of conditioning, another opportunity to discover how far psychological resilience could be developed when properly understood and systematically applied. Beryl had been correct about human stress conditioning techniques. They did not merely prepare subjects for psychological challenges. They created beings who eagerly sought such challenges, transforming fear into anticipation, obstacles into opportunities, and impossibility into inevitability. The stars outside their viewport wheeled in ancient patterns, but everything else was changing.